Thank you, Martin, for starting the recording. So I want to welcome Frank to our Coffee with a Purpose this morning. The announcement that I had sent out, I'm sure most of you have seen it, but I'll read it again in terms of just the briefest bio of where Frank currently is working and a little bit of his background. Currently president and CEO of the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Foundation, which is an independent 501c3 organization, promotes understanding and cooperation among the nations and peoples of Asia and the United States. I'm sure Frank will be telling us a lot more about the foundation's work and history, and maybe Mike Mansfield himself as we go along. And as far as Frank's career, prior to working at the foundation, he served as Deputy Executive Director for Advocacy, Policy, and Research at Amnesty International. And from 1997 to 2012, was the Policy Director for East Asian and Pacific Affairs for the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and lots more. So I will welcome you just for your benefit, but I want us to all be as brief as possible so we can hear from you as much as possible. I would like to have people briefly introduce themselves just so you can kind of get a sense of who's in the discussion. And I'll start with myself. I moderate this group, which was originally started by Pat Conaway, who's also joined us this morning. A longtime resident of the town, do a lot of volunteer work, mostly for the church, and interested in the way the world is these days. Sarah?
Hi, I'm Sarah Hanna. I am a retired hydrogeologist. My focus in my life has been environmental issues, hazardous waste kinds of things. Also, just a curious person interested in learning as much as I can about all kinds of things. So looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Elaine?
Yeah.
Find your mute there. You're currently on mute, Elaine.
I know that Elaine's ancestors were in Tianjin.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay.
Right.
Relatively new to Natick. My son and his family, Josh and Jean, have lived here for many years. I'm known to my grandchildren as Bubby Elaine. And I really appreciate this group and the people I've learned about and learned with. Thank you.
Thanks. Martin?
I'm Martin Kessel. I'm kind of the technical co-host here, and I'm many roles: open space committee, town meeting, and then my big issue right now is the Community Preservation Act, which is on the ballot tomorrow. So that's been occupying all my time, along with Cindy as well. She's part of the group, and after tomorrow, I'll have to find something else to keep me busy, but I'm sure I will.
Great. Pat?
Good morning, everybody. Pat Conaway from Keep Natick Beautiful, and we started this Coffee with a Purpose conversation a few years back with my sister Sally. We used to do it at the church there in person, but the virtual has worked quite well, and delighted the way Doug and Martin have just accepted the torch and kept it going.
Thanks, Pat. Bill?
Hi, Bill Ramage. I have a long history with Asian issues. My mother was friends with a woman in China when she went to college in the 1920s. They kept up their friendship for 50 or 60 years. My siblings and I are friends with her daughter still. So interesting background there. My son travels the world and has been in Taiwan, Vietnam, and is currently in Thailand. So always interested in what's going on, interested in environmental issues and women's reproductive rights worldwide, as well as climate change issues. So interested to hear what you have to say.
Bill, your son isn't Doug Ramage, is he?
No, Brian.
Okay.
He's
I know a Doug Ramage who's also a Southeast Asia hand.
He's a digital nomad, spends time all over the world. So
Right, and I'm sure you know Cindy, but go ahead, Cindy.
Hi, Frank. Well, you may not know that I am a trail steward here, and I'm also work for Keep Natick Beautiful. And I just want to point out Pat Conaway's T-shirt. 01760 is our zip code here in Natick. And Pat is also the founder of Keep Natick Beautiful here in Natick, not just this Coffee with a Purpose.
Right, yeah, many hats of public service. Peter.
Hi, Frank. Hi, everybody. I'm honored and pleased to see you here today, and thanks to Cindy for forming that relationship, I think. I'm trying to figure out what's going on in the general sense, and I've had an interest in world affairs and Asian affairs for decades, and look forward to hearing what you say.
Thanks, Peter. Carrie?
Hi, good morning, Frank. See, town meeting member here, concerned environmentalist. I'm treasurer for Pat's Keep Natick Beautiful, and walking on eggshells right now ahead of tomorrow's election. We'll see what happens around the nation.
Yeah. Rick?
Thanks to Frank for coming and Cindy for arranging this. And I guess my connection to Asia is thin. My great grandfather was a missionary in Japan. My grandmother and her sisters born there. And so I've sort of taken an interest in that and but I'm very interested to hear you this morning, and thanks for coming.
Thank you. Brian?
Hi, Brian McPherson. I'm an environmental activist, neighbor to Lake Cochituate, and try and promote Earth Day every day. And on that focus, everything's connected. And so we're all in this together, and hope we can live through it and improve.
Yeah.
Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Brian. Ricky?
Hi, I'm Ricky Ball, a 64-year resident of Natick, sadly no longer, but in my heart, I'm with you all. I consider myself a world citizen, having been born in Austria before the Holocaust, and have survived it, living in this country, thankfully, a League of Women Voters lady to start out with, and then first woman selectman in this town, town meeting member, housing advocate, general citizen activist.
Thank you, Ricky. Carol?
Yeah, it's hard to come after Ricky. Hi, good morning, everybody. So Frank, my name is Carol Berkowitz. I'm a town meeting member like so many others in this group. But mostly my present life is around peace. And I work for an organization called Be the Peace, and very connected to my soulmate, Hippolyte, who comes from Rwanda. And was at 7 years old. He was a survivor of the genocide. It's nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Well, maybe I should say I have an Asian grandchild, adopted grandchild.
Cool.
Cool.
And my daughter-in-law is Japanese. So.
All right. Thank you. Sally?
Good morning. I'm Sally Hopkins. I'm part of the Coffee with a Purpose. My brother Pat is one of the main inspirations for this, so I joined him in that years ago. And but really, Coffee with a Purpose is everybody you see here. It's a beautiful conglomeration. I'm fairly new. I'm a Southern Californian, and I moved to Boston. And my nephew said, I don't know how people do that, why they moved from Southern California, but it was because of the good people here. So it's a very, very great place. So thank you for being with us this morning.
My pleasure.
Thanks, Sally. Brinley?
Good morning. My name is Brinley Vickers. I am probably one of the newer members of Coffee with a Purpose, but I've known a lot of the people in it for a very long time. I'm a town meeting member. I'm very active in our community. my connection with Asia's culture. And I'm very excited to have you here and hear what you have to say. Thanks.
Thanks, Brinley. And Andy.
Hey, sorry, I don't have a webcam. But yeah, so if you guys were assuming I am the son of Doug and Sarah, and yeah, I am very interested in kind of the world connectiveness of the how the US would interface with countries around the world. I think anything we can do to help us better stand up to our values and our obligations under international covenants would not only help us, but it would help people everywhere. So I just am really interested to hear what your experience has shown you about all of that.
I just want to add really quickly that Frank is married to my cousin. That's the relationship. So I've known Frank since he was, I think, a freshman in college or a sophomore when he came to Thanksgiving.
Yeah, it's an embarrassingly long time now, Cindy.
All right. Well, thank you all for introducing yourselves. And Frank is joining us from Washington, D.C. area this morning. So thanks to Zoom, we have him with us, although we are still looking for opportunities to get together physically now and then. Frank, if you could just remind me if you have a hard stop at a particular time. Our group talks half the morning, it seems, but we'll accommodate to whatever you have.
I should stop by 10:30.
Okay, that would be fine. Yeah. Good. Well, I will turn it over to you at this point, and we usually use the convention of folks raising their hand when they want to ask a question, and we can pause for those as we go.
Awesome. Well, first of all, let me just say I'm really honored to join you this morning. I love the name of your group and its purpose, and it seems to me that just hearing briefly about your backgrounds, that many of you adhere to the notion of thinking globally and acting locally. And I sense that there's a common theme also about caring about the environment and caring about your local community in Natick. And so I'll try to make my remarks this morning sort of, to connect to that theme of some of the issues at home that you care about. But you invited me to talk about Asia, which is my passion. I've been traveling to Asia well, really since I was a boy. As a young boy, I lived in India, although I don't have very many memories of that. But starting in my teenage years, I started going to China out of a passion for the Chinese language. So I've been traveling to Asia pretty much every year since 1984. Now roughly 40 years of travel to Asia. And a couple of hundred trips to Asia during that period. I speak Chinese, but not very well anymore. I used to speak it more fluently. And I have a smattering of other Asian languages. I want to tell you just briefly about the Mansfield Foundation, where I work. We were actually created by Congress in 1983. So next year will be the 40th anniversary of our foundation. But we are private and independent foundation. We're not a part of government. But the money came from you, the taxpayers, us, the taxpayers. So thank you. Our original seed money came from a gift of $5 million from the taxpayers. And we spend the proceeds off of that as a part of our budget. Our mission is to promote understanding and cooperation. And mostly we do that by investing in people. Networks of people who can bridge the Pacific and help connect the United States to partners in Asia. We're named for Maureen and Mike Mansfield. I think probably this group of people, you may know a little bit about Maureen and Mike Mansfield, but I'll give you the 30-second elevator pitch. They are the two of the more important people that you may not have heard of. Many Americans have never heard of Mike Mansfield, but he was the Senate Majority Leader from 1961 until 1977. So he was the longest serving Senate Majority Leader in the history of our country. And it was during his tenure as Senate Majority Leader that we get the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and Title IX for women's education and sports, and a lot of other really important bipartisan pieces of legislation. He was a Montana Democrat, so he was kind of a centrist mountain state Democrat. And he had a very unusual upbringing. His mom died when he was young in Manhattan. His father couldn't cope with him, and so sent him off to Montana to be raised by his aunt and uncle. And when he was 14 years old in 1917, he ran away from home because he was very unhappy in Montana, and he joined the Navy. He lied about his age, and he served convoy duty across the Atlantic as a 14-year-old. And when the war ended, the Navy discovered he was 15 years old, and they kicked him out. And so then he joined the Army at age 16, which was the age you had to be to join the Army. He didn't like the Army, so he left after a year and he joined the Marine Corps. And the Marine Corps sent him to Asia, and he fell in love with Asia. He served in Korea and Japan and China and the Philippines. And he was there for a few years. And back in Montana, copper was booming in the 1920s because people were laying phone wire and power cables everywhere. And so copper was in high demand, and Montana had a big copper mine in Butte. So he went back to Montana to be a mucker in the copper mines and make money. And that's where he met Maureen, who would later become his wife. She was a school teacher. She was well-to-do, daughter of a banker. And they fell in love, and she wouldn't marry him because he had no education. He had dropped out of high school. He was a buck private in the Marines. And even though he was making good money shoveling copper ore into buckets, she thought that maybe he ought to aspire to something a little better than that. So he agreed to go back to school if she would pay for it. And she did. And so he went back and he got a BA and then a master's degree in Asian studies and became a professor at the University of Montana. And then they got married. And on the strength of being a veteran and being a union member from the copper mine and being a professor and being married to the banker's daughter, he checked all the political boxes, except maybe cattle ranching for Montana. And he became a very successful politician from Montana. He was known for being plain-spoken, a man of few words. I only met him once. He was a very close friend of Joe Biden's, because when Joe Biden ran for the Senate and won his Senate seat, there was a tragic accident that cost his wife and daughter in a drunk driving accident. They were hit, and Biden was going to quit the Senate. And Mike Mansfield reached out to him and said, no, don't quit. The Senate will be your family now. And Mike Mansfield took Biden under his wing and met with him every week during his first year in the Senate and got him a coveted seat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which at the time was really hard to get. Anyway, Mike Mansfield went on from being Senate Majority Leader, the longest serving Senate Majority Leader in history, to become our ambassador to Japan. And he was appointed by Jimmy Carter to be ambassador. But then in a way that's almost hard to imagine today, when Ronald Reagan became president, of course, Reagan kept him as ambassador for 8 more years. So he became the longest serving US ambassador anywhere, any place in history, almost 12 years as our ambassador to Japan. So the foundation sort of honors Maureen and Mike. Maureen, who Mike credited with everything that he ever accomplished, and Mike for his service as our representative in Tokyo back in the 80s, when US-Japan relations were really sour, and we were involved in a huge trade dispute with Japan. A lot of jobs were going over to Japan. A lot of Japanese cars were coming to America, and a lot of anxiety in America about Japan and about maybe Japan overtaking America. Flash forward 40 years, we have a very different Asia. So I want to talk to you briefly about, and I really want to leave plenty of time for conversation because I think this group is one that thrives on conversation and give and take. But what I want to talk to you about today is, the new U.S. rival in Asia, right, China, and where that U.S.-China relationship is going. Because I think we are on the edge of a new Cold War if we're not in it already. And I think it's avoidable or that it's possible to extricate ourselves from it. But we are in a dangerous time and with a lot of trend lines that are really worrisome to me as someone who cares a lot about our US-China relationship. And so it's a question from Sally, I think right out of the gate. I see a hand raised. No, not for, okay. All right, I'll keep chatting, but if you do have a question, please feel free to interrupt me. I don't mind at all. So where are we with US-Asia relations right now? We've got a president, Joe Biden, who is following along with some of the basic Asia strategies of his predecessor, Donald Trump. And those are also consistent with his predecessor, Barack Obama. And there's actually a surprising amount of continuity for these three presidents. And basically, it's taking some of the lessons of Mike Mansfield, but not all of them. The first lesson is we need to really work closely with allies and like-minded states to advance our security interests, to advance our economic interests, and to advance our values. So the most important relationships we have right now in the Asia-Pacific region are with Japan, number one, our most important alliance relationship. Mike Mansfield used to call it the most important bilateral relationship in the world, bar none. So he thought it was like absolutely the focal point of everything that the US should try to accomplish in the Asia-Pacific. We're also working really closely with South Korea, which is a democracy. It didn't used to be, but it is now, and it has peacefully transferred powers several times from one party to another, from one president to another. And South Korea is a close democratic ally and trading partner. And then we're also working closely with other Indo-Pacific nations like Australia and New Zealand that very much share American values and belief in human rights, the environment, and open flow of information. So the first pillar of our Asia strategy right now, the Indo-Pacific strategy, is working closely with these like-minded states, basically to advance the rules-based international order. What do I mean by rules-based international order? I think you know, but basically it's peaceful settlement of disputes. It's trade according to the rules of the international trading system, the World Trade Organization. It's trying to follow basic norms of human rights that are enshrined in documents like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So this first pillar, working with allies, is something that Obama was working on very much. It's something that even Trump worked on, at least with Japan. And it's something that Joe Biden is working on a lot with South Korea, with Japan, with India, and with Australia and New Zealand. Second big pillar of the US engagement with Asia used to be economics, right? We do a huge amount of business with the Indo-Pacific region. It's our largest trading partner, right? Except for Canada and Mexico. Now, Canada and Mexico are super important. They're our immediate neighbors. But after Canada and Mexico, the largest trading partner for the United States is China. And all of our top trading partners are in the Indo-Pacific region, right? Japan and Korea, China. So business is hugely important. We export grain, we export high tech, we export financial services and all kinds of services, including movies and our insurance companies and our banks are all very, very active in Asia. So it's a hugely important trading partner, and it's gotten only more important because China. has been growing so rapidly over the last 4 decades. But we face a problem on trade, and that's basically, in my mind, it's that not enough Americans are profiting from the trade we do with Asia. The CEOs are profiting and the corporations are profiting, but ordinary working Americans are not profiting nearly as much as they could be or should be from this business that we're doing with Asia. And I think partly as a result of that, many Americans are beginning to question fundamentally, our open door policy on trade. So we see more and more indications that Americans are nervous about an unfair playing field. They worry about cheap labor in Asia that is undercutting American labor. They worry about the theft of our intellectual property. There are a lot of Massachusetts companies that are very high tech, and a lot of that high tech is being stolen by Chinese companies instead of purchased. And so I think many Americans are frustrated by that. And as a result, what we see is a kind of a drop in the American appetite to maintain an open door and do a lot of business with countries in Asia, many of which are undercutting us or dumping product on the American market or stealing intellectual property. So there used to be this consensus that we should keep pressing open markets. And now we see a movement to close markets or to put tariffs on goods coming from China. I want to talk now about China because China is at the core of both the opportunity in Asia, but also the kind of anxiety about Asia. And for most of our lives, China was weak. China was in the 1920s, was in warlords and chaos. China in the 1930s was invaded by Japan and was in war. China in the 1940s was in internal revolution with nationalists fighting against communists, right? And then China in the 1950s, it was the Cold War and China was closed. Nobody could go there. They slammed the door shut. Missionaries couldn't go, business people couldn't go. And China suffered greatly during what was called the Great Leap Forward. It was really a great leap backwards for China. Then the 1960s came and China was in cultural revolution. The whole society was turned upside down and their economy was in turmoil. And millions of people starved to death because of the bad policies of Mao Zedong. And China remained closed. All of that changed in 1979 with the launch of something called Reform and Opening Up by Deng Xiaoping. And China opened to the world, and America normalized our diplomatic relations with China in 1979. And we began to do business with China. And people like me started to travel to China as students in the 80s. And business people started to open up China. And everyone was looking at China in the 1980s and saying, wow, this is a great opportunity. This is 1/5 of humanity. And they are joining the world. And Mike Mansfield traveled to China in 1979, right after we normalized diplomatic relations. And he came back and he said, oh, this is great. China is going to be our partner. China is going to grow, they're going to modernize, they're going to open up. Maybe they'll even become more democratic over time. They're going to become less communist in their economics and more capitalist. And this is going to be really good for the Chinese people. And it has been pretty good for the Chinese people. They've had 4 decades of economic growth. They are a much more prosperous, healthy country today than they were 40 years ago. Chinese people are traveling around the world. There's 300,000 Chinese students in America, the #1 source of foreign students in our universities. Most of them pay full tuition, so the universities are happy to have them. China also has more access to information than ever before. Chinese people are more free today than they were 40 or 50 years ago. But as China has gotten stronger and stronger, China has also recovered some of China's ambition to be the #1 power in Asia, which is where they were traditionally for the better part of 2,000 years. It's easy to forget that that weak China, that China that was in revolution and chaos and communist, Cold War, closed doors, that's the anomaly. For most of China's history, China's been #1, maybe #1 economy in the world, #1 with culture and science, #1 in population, and #1 in Asia in terms of power. And China doesn't like being, a poor, weak country any more than any other country does. But especially when you've been on top, there's a desire to reclaim that position. And I probably read too much into it because I'm not a psychologist or a sociologist by training. I studied history, but I think there's a psychological aspect here that's at play that has to do with the one family, one child policy of China. You may be familiar that because they were worried about overpopulation, for the better part of 3 decades, China said to every family, you're only allowed to have 1 child. Now they've abolished that restriction now because they're worried that they're getting older and they're worried that they don't have enough workers. But the generation that is going to be running China for the next 20 or 30 years, they're all people with no brothers and sisters. They never had to share any toys. They got 4 grandparents for 1 child, for 1 grandchild. Frankly, they're spoiled rotten. They've grown up as princelings and princesses, and they don't have to share. And they're proud of China and what China has accomplished over the last 4 decades, going from a poor country to a middle income country, right? Going from a weak country to a nuclear power with aircraft carriers and the ability to project power and the #2 economy in the whole world. And they want to reclaim their position, in Asia. And probably that would be okay with the US if we thought that they were going to play by the rules. But we're worried that they're not going to play by the rules. And I'm going to stop my talk by sort of just asking a question for the group. And I'm happy to give my own answer to it as well. But I think the key question right now about China is whether they are a revolutionary power. Do they want to overturn the global system? Because if they do, then most likely the US and China are on a collision course. But at the same time, the system has worked really well for China for the last 40 years. China has prospered and thrived by joining the rules-based order that the United States and the European countries formed at the end of World War II, right? The United Nations, the World Trade Organization, NATO, the security and the opening of markets, the sharing of investment around the world, the Marshall Plan, the rebuilding of Europe, the rebuilding, hi Aunt Nancy, the rebuilding of Asia after World War II. All of that is a world that China has participated in and where China has thrived. And so for me, the real question is sort of, is this a revolutionary power that wants to overturn the world order? Because if so, we're on a collision course. Or are they a power that wants to tweak the rules, right? Maybe use the system to their advantage, but remain a part of it. In which case, we can probably find accommodation and compromise and make room for China, which wants to be a global player. The one issue that is potentially an issue over which the US and China could come to blows is Taiwan, right? Taiwan. And that's a tough one, because for China, Taiwan is a renegade province. When I took Biden to China in 2001, we met with the head of their Foreign Relations Committee of the National People's Congress, sort of Biden's counterpart. He also used to be their ambassador to the United States, and he was someone that both Biden and I knew pretty well. And before the meeting started, Biden was a little bit late, and I was just chatting with this guy, Li Jiaoxing, who was the former foreign minister and the former ambassador to the United States. And we were just talking about the US and China. And I said, you know, I'm very proud of the fact that I've been to every province of China. You know, I've traveled to every province. And he said, well, I'm proud of the fact I've been to every state in the United States, which I have not been. And I said, oh, that's amazing. You know, because as ambassador, he traveled to all 50 states. And then he said, you know, I've also been to every province of China except for one, Taiwan. The Chinese consider Taiwan a province. And the US basically says, well, we don't know what Taiwan is, but we think Taiwan's future has to be determined peacefully. And the Chinese say, well, that's fine. We would like to settle this issue peacefully, but if we can't, we reserve the right to use force, because after all, it's part of China. And if we have to use force to reunify China, we will. A lot of this wasn't so scary when the people on Taiwan considered themselves Chinese. At the end of World War II, a lot of mainlanders left mainland China and fled to Taiwan, including Chiang Kai-shek, right? And the government of Taiwan became a government that was dominated by people from the mainland. And for many years, the people of Taiwan thought that they were the legitimate government of all of China. And they did not dispute the fact that Taiwan was part of China. All of that changed about 30 years ago as the mainlanders began to die off and generations of Taiwanese were born on the island. And now if you ask people on Taiwan, are you Chinese or Taiwanese? Overwhelmingly, 90% plus, they say we are Taiwanese. We are not Chinese. And they gave up the ambition to be the government of China. They have formally renounced that. They say we are not the government of China, but we have our own country right here on Taiwan. And they don't want to give that up. And again, in the past, the Chinese were trying to court the Taiwanese, you know, trying to sort of say, hey, you know, come join us and your life will be better. You will be richer, you will be safer, you'll be reunified with the motherland. We are one big Chinese family. And for a while, that message kind of resonated with many on Taiwan. Not everybody, but many people on Taiwan thought, yeah, that could be a good future for us. But not anymore. Because the people on Taiwan have looked at what's happened in Hong Kong, where the Chinese have clamped down on the freedom that the Hong Kong people used to enjoy. And the Taiwanese say, well, look, why should we give up what we enjoy now just to be reunified, you know, with the motherland? What's in it for us? And the Chinese don't have a good answer to that right now. So we are in a dangerous period. I know the leader of Taiwan really well. Her name is Tsai Ing-wen, and she's a lawyer, and she's super smart, and she's super careful, and she's been really, really careful not to piss off China too much. She has been super careful not to declare independence because she doesn't want to fight with China. But who will follow her? who, in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, maybe there's a less careful Taiwan leader, someone a little bolder about declaring their independence. And I think no leader of China can stay the leader of China if Taiwan declares their independence and the leader of China lets that happen. Because the Chinese people themselves would consider that a betrayal. So we have work to do on Taiwan, and there's no easy answers, because unification with China is not an option right now because the people of Taiwan don't want it. War with Taiwan and China would be horrific. It would be just catastrophic for the world. And it seems very likely to me that the US would become involved, even though we don't have any treaty obligations with Taiwan, and even though Taiwan is far away. But I'm really curious about your thinking about all of this, and I will stop there and welcome your questions. I see Sally Hopkins has her hand raised, and there are a couple other hands raised too. And I don't know.
Yeah,
Doug, let's
start with Sally, and then we'll go to Bill and then Andy after that. And if people can use the raise hand, it allows me to keep track of the order, but that's fine.
I'm sorry, I was being low tech.
No, that's okay.
I'd love, Frank, I'm just a little bit nostalgia for the time in the 50s when I was a teenager, and my parents were very liberal Democrats, and Madam Chiang Kai-shek came to the White House to spend the night, and she wanted the silk sheets, and Truman didn't offer silk sheets. And I was wondering, I sort of need to know, I've got this little capsulated experience and perception. Is Taiwan a place where a lot of wealthy elites who are kind of superior in their sensibility about the rest of China? Is it kind of, even though they're democratic and they seem so wonderful and they're modern, and I'm wondering if Taiwan is a place, a haven of elitists, and that's why the mainland really wants to grab them?
The short answer is no. Taiwan is populated in part by Fujian ethnic sort of minority Chinese who have a distinct language and cultural identity from southeastern China. They are not considered to be elites. The elites are more the Beijingers or Shanghai. Shanghai and Beijing compete for the status of who's going to be on top of the pecking order in terms of blue blood elite Chinese. Cantonese in the south also are very proud, but they are generally reviled by the rest of the Chinese as crass business people who just want to make money. Whereas Shanghai and Beijing are held up as sort of the cultural elite and the political elite of the country. So the short answer is no. There are some on Taiwan who are descended from Suzhou, Shanghai, and Beijing elite. So some of the ruling families, if you will, some of the oligarchs on Taiwan trace their bloodlines to Beijing and Shanghai and Suzhou elite. But they do not comprise a majority of the population. And I think that the Chinese want Taiwan to be re-assimilated, mostly just because its status as an independent, democratic, free Chinese nation threatens the mythology of the Communist Party. It threatens their legitimacy and their claim to authenticity and the superiority of their system. So the Chinese leadership in Beijing justifies holding on to power for the Communist Party by basically saying China's not ready for genuine democracy. And the Taiwanese prove that that's not necessarily true. In other words, Taiwan is governing itself democratically and openly and competitively with a transfer of power between parties, from the Kuomintang to the Democratic Progressive Party and back and forth with mayors and local leaders belonging to one party or another party. So it's a very competitive democratic system. And I think it constitutes a threat to the Chinese. And I think that's why they want it, not so much because it's elite. But it's a good question.
Thank you for that, Frank. Bill?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can form this question, but my son lived in Taipei for most of COVID. He escaped Vietnam the morning that Taiwan shut their borders, and then was there for over a year. I had no interest in coming back to this COVID-infected country that we live in. So he stayed there.
Safer there.
And his perceptions, he had a couple of perceptions that I'd like to throw out and see what your reaction is to. The first one is that most of the folks that he worked with, and he was a digital nomad, so he had expats there, but he met a lot of Taiwanese as well, just didn't get the sense that anybody was too concerned about China invading Taiwan. So that's one thing. The other thing that he said, which you haven't mentioned specifically, but you've hinted at, is that the Chinese think in terms of decades. So his sense was that the Chinese would have a plan and an expectation that over the next 50 years, they will be able to convince enough Taiwanese that they should be Chinese or reaffiliate with China. So they're playing a long game. They've done it with their irrigation systems, with the Yangtze Dam, which we observed when we were there in 2006. So I just wanted to get a sense from you as to whether he was on point, or if you could comment on that. Thank you.
Well, he's 100% on point in terms of both the attitudes of the Taiwanese, who are quite relaxed about the threat from China. And he's also on point, I think, about China taking the long view, perhaps until recently. So on the first point, many Taiwanese really cannot imagine that China would use force against sort of their own people, right? And they believe that, even though back in the 50s, China routinely shelled Quemoy and Matsu, two little islands that were just off the coast of China, and there were little military outposts of Chiang Kai-shek. That was sort of the last little bits of the Civil War playing out. And it was military against military. It wasn't military against civilians. But most Taiwanese are remarkably blasé about any threat from China. They don't spend their time worrying about it. And one of the manifestations of that is that their defense budget is quite modest. Taiwan spends less than 2% of their gross domestic product on defense, and we spend about 6%. Now, I happen to think we spend too much, but we have big global obligations. The Taiwanese, if they were under threat, they could afford to spend a lot more for their own defense, and they're not, right? They'd rather spend it on education and high tech and infrastructure and schools and bridges and all the rest. And that's where they're putting their money until recently. And they're just barely beginning to increase their defense spending a little. And I do think that China takes the long game. I think that China can live with Taiwan trapped in their orbit. As long as Taiwan is a moon sort of orbiting around China, I think the Chinese leadership can live with that for a long time. But if they start to get the feeling that Taiwan is a moon that is going to achieve escape velocity, and is going to be propelled out of China's orbit, then I think that long view, that is their preferred approach, comes into conflict with the possibility that Taiwan might become a de jure independent nation state. And I think that's something that the Chinese don't have a stomach for. So that's why, Bill, the long view is coming under threat now. And we do see actual evidence. I mean, it's not just words, but we see evidence of China building the military capacity that they would need to try to blockade Taiwan or to try to force Taiwan to surrender either by missile bombardment or amphibious invasion. And until recently, we didn't have evidence to support that, but now we do. So that makes me nervous about how patient the Chinese will be.
Just a quick follow-up, and that is, what do you think the United States will do if China takes aggressive action against Taiwan?
It's really, really hard to predict because we have no treaty obligation. We used to have a treaty obligation. We abrogated that treaty. We pulled out of that treaty in 1979 when we normalized relations with China. It was a condition of normalizing relations with China. So we have no treaty obligation, but we have a law called the Taiwan Relations Act. Taiwan Relations Act obligates, it's not even a discretion, it obligates us to sell Taiwan weapons for their defense. We also, in that law, it says that any threat to Taiwan would be considered a grave threat to the United States. And that language is diplomatic language, but it basically means that it's the kind of threat that might merit direct US military action. Different presidents have maintained what's called a policy of strategic ambiguity about whether we would or would not come to Taiwan's defense. The reason for that ambiguity is twofold. One is we didn't want to put our finger directly in China's eye, right? We didn't want to insult them directly. The other reason is we didn't want to give Taiwan a blank check, because if we said to the Taiwanese, we promise you 100%, you can count on us, no matter what, we will be there for you if you declare independence, no matter what happens, if you're attacked, we got your back. Well, that might embolden them to do things that would be unwise. So for a long time, we've maintained this policy of ambiguity. It kind of makes sense when you think about it, but it also means that the question that you ask doesn't have a clear answer. If it doesn't have a clear answer, then the Chinese might say to themselves, yeah, they're bluffing, right? And I don't know the answer to your question. And I think it would depend, frankly, I think it would depend a lot on who is president. And I also think it would depend a lot on the circumstances. Because if the Taiwanese said to the Chinese, we're done with you, we are declaring our independence, and we call on the world to come to our aid, I'm not sure that a lot of Americans want to go fight and die for Taiwan's right to declare their independence. It's like, you were doing just fine. Why did you declare independence? You had it, and now you're going to lose it because you declared it. And I'm not going to send the 7th Fleet over there to defend your right to declare your independence. But I think other Americans, and I think this is where I would be, if China attacked Taiwan because of this, that would be a very dangerous China. In other words, if the Chinese were so thin-skinned that Taiwan declaring their independence meant they had to go to war and try to destroy Taiwan, that would be a very dangerous China. And something I learned from Steve Solars, he was a congressman from Brooklyn. He was his family were Holocaust survivors, and he taught me that there's a difference between evil and evil on the march. There's a lot of evil in the world. You know, there are a lot of bad things that are happening in the world, and we don't go to war, you know, to try to eradicate evil. But evil on the march needs to be confronted, and a China that was going to invade Taiwan and maybe kill hundreds of thousands of people, that would be a pretty evil deed, no matter how you justify it in terms of China's ambition to be reunified. And I think it would pose a real threat to us, and also to Japan. And all of this would be happening, by the way. I mean, geography matters, right? All of this would be happening about 90 miles from Okinawa, where there's the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Unit and a bunch of US military. So it's not like this would be some remote conflict thousands of miles away. You know, there would be US military directly in harm's way if the Chinese attacked Taiwan. So it seems to me it would be a high probability that we would be involved, but the exact answer is unknowable.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks. Andy?
Hi, just returning to the question you asked a little while ago about whether or not China is trying to change the world order or just tweak it.
Yeah.
I think it's the latter. I think before you kind of gave a overview of their history from the 1920s onward, but even before then, they have this this idea of the century of shame or humiliation that they utilize in their rhetoric to point to Western imperialism as the reason as to why they were so victimized by the rest of the world.
Exactly.
So I think they feel as though they are justified in breaking the rules a little bit because they feel like they're the victim of the world breaking the rules to their detriment. And then as terms of their like territorial ambitions, I don't see them extending beyond what they feel their ancient kind of grounds are. So like the Taiwan, and I think the only other one I am aware of is the border with India.
Exactly.
So yeah, that's my take on it. I don't know what you think.
No, thank you, Andy. I appreciate your sharing your take because I think it's a well-informed perspective. And I very much share your view. I will briefly, as a point of history, just elaborate on a very important observation you made, Andy, which is that you said that you didn't think China has territorial ambition beyond Taiwan or maybe a little minor adjustment on the India border. I think you're 100% correct on that. In that sense, it's a very different situation than during the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Soviet Union had occupied large parts of Eastern Europe. And they had territorial ambition for their own security that went far beyond ethnic Russian regions, to include, you know, Poland and the Baltic states and Central Europe and South and even Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. China, by contrast, has long been settled within its current borders. And the periods of greatest expansion of China, to include the Northwest region of Xinjiang, the Muslim region of the Northwest, and also Tibet. Interestingly, those periods of expansion were under the Mongolian dynasty, right? The Yuan dynasty, which was Mongolian, Genghis Khan, and the Qing dynasty, which was Manchurian. So the two times in history that China has sort of grown its borders through military occupation were both times when China was actually under foreign rule. The Mongolians were very ambitious, and they grew the borders of China to include Tibet and the Manchus, the Qing dynasty, the last dynasty of China. They were also territorially ambitious in the Northwest. They wanted to consolidate China's hold over Xinjiang in the Northwest, because that was very important for the trading routes of China to Europe. So the Han people, the ethnic Han, who are 90% of China, they traditionally have not been territorially ambitious. And there's no hint that this China wants to invade Mongolia or invade Vietnam or conquer Japan. Their ambition seems to be limited to recovering Taiwan eventually, and defending the high ground in the Himalayas on the India border. Yeah, so I think I share your view, Andy, but I'm not sure about it, which is one of the reasons why I asked the question, because I'm really curious about what other people think, because I think I could be wrong.
I feel like one of the easiest ways in which it doesn't go that way is if there's a shift in the leadership of the CCP and somebody needs to justify their position change, and they do so by acting in a way that is divergent from that history.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah. Let's go to Carrie and Pat. I know Ricky's got her hand up as well, but I would just like to take folks in order. So I'll keep you in mind, Ricky, but Carrie, you're next.
Yeah, sure. Just first of all, fascinating discussion there, Frank. Thank you very much. And a couple comments/questions, partly following up on what Andy was just discussing. Well, yesterday, Fareed Zakari would mention how after experiencing double-digit growth for years, they only grew at about 3%, I believe, right now. Is that going to weaken some of their aspirations? Another thing is, now that Xi Jinping is apparently leader for life, and his ideas about world dominance, I've heard that he's been cozying up to some different countries, particularly in Africa, that have ports right now, and seem to build his own sort of bases, military bases there. Thoughts on that? And then lastly, any speculation on what happened to Hu Jintao?
Great. Thanks for the question, Carrie. Fareed Zakari was a classmate of mine, and I know him really well, and he's a really smart guy, and I'm jealous of him because he's got a great weekly TV show. And he's super smart, and he's spot on China's economy slowing down. And the Chinese economy is slowing down for lots of reasons. It's definitely COVID related, but it's also an aging population. Their wages are up, their competitive advantage is less than it used to be. So a lot of new money for foreign investment is going to places like Indonesia and Vietnam and Bangladesh and India with lower wages than China. So the Chinese are struggling to climb up the value chain and produce goods of higher value to justify higher prices. And they've also done a lot of the easy things. I mean, none of it was really easy, but a lot of their modernization over the last 40 years, it involved capital investments in infrastructure, ports, bridges, roads, and urbanization, and building factories. And they've done all of that. And now they really need to build a knowledge economy and be competitive in higher tech. And that's hard. So their economy is slowing down, and they're probably facing slower growth from here on out compared to where they were for the last 4 decades. And the challenge that poses to the Communist Party is that in a democracy, at least in a functioning democracy, leaders enjoy democratic legitimacy, right? They are leaders because they were chosen by the people. And in China, that's not available for the leadership. They are chosen indirectly by the party, and not most Chinese don't have a voice in that process. And the reason that most Chinese have supported the leadership is because their lives have been getting better and better and better for 4 decades. And so it's what's called performance legitimacy. You know, if you make lives better, people are pretty tolerant. They're going to re-elect you. Or if they don't even have a voice in election, they're going to support you anyway because, you know, the life for their children is better than the life that they enjoyed. When that begins to unravel, the Chinese leadership in the past could rely on revolutionary legitimacy. We're your leader because we fought the Japanese. We're your leader because we, you know, conquered the nationalists and unified China, right? But this generation of leadership doesn't have that legitimacy either. So they don't have democratic legitimacy. They don't have founding father legitimacy. The only legitimacy they really have, they're two pillars. One is economic growth, and that pillar is weakening, and the other is nationalism. And so if they rely more and more on nationalism for legitimacy, they become a more dangerous country almost by default, because they're likely to throw their weight around a little bit in order to keep the country unified. That goes to the second point about Xi Jinping. Chinese leadership for most of the decades since Mao Zedong, right? Since 1979, Chinese leadership has been a collective leadership. It's been ruled by consensus, and no leader has been very, very strong. So even Deng Xiaoping, he was the strongest leader after Mao, but he didn't even have any official titles. He wasn't president of China. He wasn't secretary of the party. He was an amazing leader because he kind of ruled without title. Xi Jinping has consolidated power to himself at the expense of almost everyone else. And that makes him both a very strong leader, but also potentially a weak leader, because if things go badly, it's hard for him to blame someone else. You know, the responsibility is going to be on his shoulders. Hu Jintao, there's all this speculation. I know Hu Jintao a little. I've met him. I haven't been in the room with him for years, but everything that I saw suggests a guy in frail health. He did not want to leave the room. He was escorted out of the room against his wishes, but not because of politics. Okay. Just because he didn't want to leave, because he was embarrassed to be told that he had to leave.
Well, the speculation, no one's seen him since that event.
Because probably his health is not good, and he may have even suffered an episode. I don't know that, but it was not a political power move by Xi Jinping. There's a lot of speculation. That the last thing Xi Jinping wanted was to have this ceremony disrupted in any way. So I think it was an unfortunate health related episode, which doesn't mean that he was happy about it. I mean, he clearly was unhappy about it. But I think just in that way that someone who is old and embarrassed to be told by someone, no, you got to get out of here. I mean, he was not happy, but it wasn't political.
Just before Pat jumps in, I just want to reiterate the other point about whether or not they're actually looking to build military bases.
Oh, yeah. You're real quick on this, because it's a really good question. In the old China of 1949, China's economic interest did not extend much beyond China's borders. China is now absolutely a global economic player in every way, on every continent, with every country. And they are going to build, in the same way that the US has built military capability to defend our economic interests and our citizens abroad, the Chinese are going to do the same. They're not going to call them bases. It's going to be access agreements or friendly governments that will allow the Navy to come and visit, make a port of call. It won't be like we have formal bases with troops stationed overseas permanently in dozens of countries around the world. The Chinese won't do that, in my view. But what they are going to do is they're going to have these access agreements. They're going to visit regularly. They're going to pre-position some equipment and supplies in places like Cambodia and East Africa. And it's to defend their global economic interests and their citizens. There are tens of thousands of Chinese construction workers, in the Middle East. If there's a revolution there in Bahrain and there's turmoil, the Chinese want to be able to secure their citizens' safety and evacuate them. If an oil company in Sudan that is Chinese invested, is nationalized by some rebel group. The Chinese want to have the military capability to go in there and defend their investment. So we should expect China to build military capabilities commensurate with China's global economic reach. And so this is not going to be a China that is limited to their borders when it comes to their.
There's like a precursor to World War III potentially, and then world dominance taking over.
There is every possibility of friction as China begins to operate more globally, in the same way that we had to work out rules of the road with the Russians so that our navies, wouldn't ram each other and our spy planes wouldn't shoot each other down. We're going to need to work those out with the Chinese, because the Chinese are not going to be inside a box. They're going to be global.
Great, thanks for all that. Sorry, Pat, for taking so much time.
No, that's fine. Yeah, we do it. We have 5 people with their hands up now, so I do want to
try to keep my answers
move
shorter.
along. I mean, everything that's been discussed is fine.
I have a quick
Pat,
question,
yeah.
a quick couple of them. To what extent was Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan kind of a finger in the eye as far as the Chinese looked at it? And the Chinese, like everything you've been saying, their real power though is, I mean, they do have a kind of a building up, a growing military force, obviously, but there's such an economic power that, contrast them to the Russians or the Iranians, or that the Chinese are real powerful, and like we are, and that's what I kind of wonder about, these are the 2 major powers in the world.
Yeah, Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan is something that if I were advising her, I would have told her not to go, because it was a purely symbolic gesture that could only piss off the Chinese and really do nothing to make Taiwan more secure. But Nancy Pelosi has had a long-standing, heartfelt commitment to the people of Taiwan as democratic, human rights loving, freedom loving people. And I can't fault her for that. And I think she traveled there partly for her legacy. I think she wanted to be a Speaker of the House who visited Taiwan. I think she knew the Chinese wouldn't like it, and she didn't care so much. The Chinese also, to be fair here, they kind of had to protest it. But I spent my first 9 years in government studying the Chinese military and studying China. And my assessment of how they responded was it was actually pretty restrained. And they did everything carefully in a way that they knew would not escalate. So I think that both sides were playing a role. Nancy was playing a role for her legacy and showing the people of Taiwan that she cares about them, and showing the people of China that she won't be intimidated. I think the Chinese were playing a role too. They were saying, well, of course we have to respond to this. We're going to have a show of force. I was in the region at the time. I was in Singapore during her visit, and then to Hanoi and Bangkok. And what I can tell you is that in the region, a lot of countries thought that what China did was justified. In other words, they thought that their response to her visit was justified. The outlier there was Japan. Japan did not agree with what China did. The Japanese were upset by the show of force by China, and they felt that it revealed China to be a belligerent bully. The Koreans, interestingly enough, were very cautious. President Yoon of South Korea refused to meet with Nancy when she came to Korea after visiting Taiwan. He was conveniently on vacation. He was in Seoul. He was in the city where she was on vacation, but he didn't have time to meet with her because he didn't want to, draw fire from China. So I think her visit was it had mixed reviews in the region. And your point, though, is also a good one, which is that China is the #1 economic trading partner with all of its neighbors. In other words, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, Singapore. So they have real economic leverage on all of their neighbors. And so most of their neighbors don't want to pick a fight with Beijing.
It's a chess match, I guess. Cindy and then Ricky, and then we can go to Peter and Rick. Cindy? You're on mute. You got to come off. There you go.
Just a quick question, which is one I often ask you, Frank, about North Korea. It seems scary over so often, and then but overall, like nothing seems to be like, I don't know.
Yeah. So North Korea's launched more missiles in the last week than they do most years. And this is in response to US military exercises with South Korea that resumed after 3 years of being on the back burner. And the North Koreans felt they had to respond to that with a show of force of their own in response to the American show of force with the South Koreans. South Korea has a new president. The old president set aside the high-profile military exercises because he was trying to make peace with the North. The North did not reward the old president for his efforts. The new president said, "Well, to heck with that. If being restrained doesn't get any reward, I'm going to go ahead and resume these exercises in order to show that we are able to defend the peninsula if we need to." And the North predictably was upset, and so they responded. Unfortunately, North Korea basically has decided they want to be a nuclear power, and who can blame them? They are surrounded by nuclear states, China, Russia, the US. Japan and South Korea are not nuclear states, but they are rich, powerful countries, far more powerful than North Korea. So North Korea is a little country surrounded by big countries. It's a frightened small country, and they see nuclear weapons as a key to their survival. So they're not going to give them up. The US has a real tough time managing this problem because there's really only 2 ways to try to get them to behave better. One is to threaten them. That rarely works. I mean, nobody likes being threatened. You can intimidate people for a while, but there's only so much you can accomplish by threatening people. The other way is to bribe them, and that doesn't work either because the North Koreans are proud, and they might be willing to take a little something to moderate their behavior a little as a bribe, but that doesn't feel good. Paying a bribe to a country that is oppressing its own people the way that they are and behaving bad on the international scene, I don't think any American or South Korean really feels good about that. It feels dirty to pay protection money, basically, to pay a bribe to try to convince the North Koreans to behave a little better. And so Biden,
Rodman over there.
Yeah. So I mean, I think we're really at our wit's end in terms of how to manage this problem. And Biden has basically decided he's just going to deter them and make sure that they know that we're ready if they want to try something. The one advice I have that I've offered to the administration, but it's kind of a form of political suicide. So understandably, they haven't picked it up. I think we could try some tactical maneuvers. We could try some tricky little tactical maneuvers that might put North Korea on their back foot. We could, for instance, nominate an ambassador to North Korea and say, hey, we'd like to send an ambassador. We know that you don't want to give up your nukes. We know that you don't want to talk to us, but whenever you're ready to talk, we're ready. And the worst thing they could do is say no. And I think gestures like that that were peaceful might be interesting. The other thing that we could do, which we haven't done, is we could just declare the war is over. We could say, hey, I know that we've been at this war for 70 years, but we're done. We're tired. We're declaring the war over. If you want to consider the war still going on, that's on you. But for us, this war is over. You're not our enemy. We're not coming to get you. We're not going to go to war to throw you, out of power. We consider the war done. And I think that would also shake things up a little bit, because the North Koreans, they kind of thrive on the bunker mentality, But again, both of those moves, I think, would basically be political suicide here in Washington. If Biden declared the war over, I think he'd be attacked for being soft on North Korea and giving up on the war when they still have nuclear weapons. And assigning an ambassador, even though we do recognize North Korea exists as a country, assigning an ambassador, I think, would also be judged as something that would sort of be some sort of a softy move. Most people would probably think it was a mistake. I think it might be tactically useful, maybe put North Korea on the back foot.
Thanks, Frank. I also want to be mindful of your time. You said you had till about 10:30, and we've
Yeah,
got
so about 10 minutes.
10 minutes. So we've got three people still with questions. So Ricky, thanks for being patient. If you want to take yourself off mute and ask, you can find your mute there. Still hunting for that a bit.
It's usually down in the lower left corner, but I guess it depends.
Yeah, I think she may be using Jay's computer and might not be as familiar to her.
Yeah,
but
it's all good. I know I heard Ricky earlier, so I know she can unmute.
Right. We also have some thank yous from Brinley, who has to be leaving us. If we do get time, she also has a question, but going in. Oh, good. Go ahead.
Ricky's good to go.
Good, Ricky.
Oh, I got it. Thank you for letting me ask my question. When we were in China about, I don't know, 6 years ago, we saw a huge amount of construction all over the place. The pollution was phenomenal, but the construction was widespread and all the buildings were empty. There were buildings that were finished but empty. And apparently there is a billionaire in China who controls that industry and has produced, I don't know, a situation there that's quite unique. Do you know anything about that? And has it been resolved in the housing market in China? And I guess the other the flashpoints for China are Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Tibet. When people heard that we had actually gone to Tibet, Chinese people, oh, they were amazed that we actually got there. And it was interesting to see the suppression of Tibetan culture that's that the Chinese seem to be engaging in when it comes to Tibet. Comments?
Thank you so much, Ricky. Really great questions. So the housing bubble in China is real. They have overbuilt in terms of immediate demand, but they have not overbuilt in terms of long-term demand, because there still are probably another 100 million Chinese who want to move out of the farm and into the city. So those apartment buildings are going to be occupied. But the thing about China is that unlike our system, with all of its flaws, their system economically is very much still command driven, and those billionaires have huge influence and access to finance. So So those billionaires working with the Bank of China and the People's Agricultural Bank of China had access to lots and lots of cheap money. And they used it to build those apartments, and they pocketed all of their graft and corruption money, so that even if the apartments haven't sold, the billionaires are doing just fine. It's caused a real problem for Xi Jinping and the leadership, because there's a lot of essentially bad loans, like our housing bubble, a lot of bad mortgages. And so this could yet come back to haunt Xi Jinping if it brings down the Chinese economy and brings them into recession. So there are huge environmental downstream problems that China faces also. They've been growing for 4 decades with zero pollution controls on water and air. And they're paid a huge price in terms of the lives of their people. 50% of the groundwater in China is unfit for human or animal consumption. They have a huge water shortage. They have some of the worst air pollution on the planet, second only maybe to India. They're working to clean it up. They're trying hard to clean it up. They're planting trees everywhere. They're building cleaner power plants, and they finally, there is an environmental movement in China that is from the masses. The people want to be able to breathe, so the Chinese people are demanding cleaner air and cleaner water, but they have a long way to go. Tibet is a particular soft spot for me. I've traveled to Tibet several times, and it is tragic what has happened in the Tibetan regions of China. It is similar, frankly, to what America did to Native Americans. It's a push to assimilate the Tibetans and make them more Chinese. The Chinese think of it as charitable. The Chinese don't think of it as oppression. They think of it as, these poor Tibetans, they need to learn Chinese, they need to become computer programmers. Why are they living in poverty? Why are they following a backward religion? They should be, modernized. And the Chinese people really think, many Chinese people think that what China has done in Tibet is a great gift to the Tibetan people. The Tibetans don't view it that way, most Tibetans, because it's a culturally heavy-handed approach that is eradicating their language and their faith and their culture. So I don't know what's going to happen there. I can tell you that Tibetan culture is very resilient. So I don't think it's going to be eradicated. And I also think that many Chinese have a spiritual void that they want to fill through the study of philosophy and religion. And Tibetan Buddhism is actually becoming more popular in other parts of China as people are sort of discovering faith in China and searching for meaning in their lives beyond just getting rich. So it's an open question. I think what's going to happen with Buddhism in China, especially Tibetan Buddhism, but for sure the Tibetan culture is under enormous pressure. And there's a huge number of Chinese who have flowed into the Tibetan regions. So the Tibetans are now minorities in their own land, much as Native Americans, are to the extent that they still exist. It's like in reservations, or they are minorities, on land that used to be theirs.
Yeah.
So-
When we went there, there's great electrification going on. And as you say, the tree planting was everywhere. And it was very obviously, government driven. It wasn't individuals.
Yeah,
And,
huge projects to try to clean up the environment.
Yeah. So Frank, I see it's 10:30. I know that Peter's
I
also been very patient.
Yeah,
I'm
I can
wondering if you could
extend
take
this.
one more question.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
So 2 parts to that, Frank, before we let you go. Prefacing that by saying thanks so much for being with us.
You're welcome.
First one,
Yeah.
I've always viewed the Red Army as the epicenter of Chinese politics, number one. And number two, what's the future of capitalist enterprise within the Chinese communist system?
Two great questions, and I'm not sure that on the first one, I'm not sure how up to date my information is. Let me say about the Red Army, because you're right that the Red Army, the PLA, has been one with the party, and in a way that maybe the Soviet Union was a little different. I think the Soviet army had political commissars who were mindful of watching the army to make sure that it stayed in line. Whereas I think the People's Liberation Army was more fully integrated with the party leadership. And there was less division between the army and the party in China. One of the things that's happened to the People's Liberation Army, however, is that it's much, much smaller than it used to be. It used to be a massive people's army, 4 million men under arms. Now it's about 1 million. And there's been a huge demobilization because the People's Liberation Army has modernized. So, when you've got a self-propelled artillery piece that drives itself and has an auto loader, you only need a crew of 2 or 3 people in that gun, to run it. If you want to run a field artillery piece and tow it behind a truck, you might need a dozen people, to crew that gun. So the People's Liberation Army is a modern fighting force now, much more so than it used to be, and it's much, much smaller, and it's also much more high tech. So it's less reliant on tactics of mass warfare, right? It's much more a modern fighting force. And I think they're less political. I think they are less engaged in politics. The People's Liberation Army also used to do lots of construction work around the country. They do less of that now. They're more focused on actual war fighting and not as much on building bridges. Capitalism in China, in some ways they're becoming more capitalist than we are. In some ways, we have Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. The Chinese healthcare system is kind of in shambles. If you want to get good healthcare in China, you need to have a private healthcare insurance. Or pay cash for it. The public healthcare system in China is broken. They don't really have an adequate retirement system. Retirement in China used to be children were your Social Security. But with the one family, one child policy, how is one child going to care for 4 elderly grandparents? So the government now needs to step in, and they haven't really done the work yet to finance this. This is a looming crisis in China because by 2030, there's going to be 350 million retired Chinese. It's going to be a real burden on their economy to try to care for all those retirees when they don't have. So capitalism also in China has kind of reached some limit, however. What I mean is that for most of the last 4 decades, the Chinese were selling off state companies and privatizing them. So you might have had the number 1 automobile factory of Beijing, which could have been a state-owned company, and then it was sold off, to a private car company and retooled and reimagined and became a private sector company. But the Chinese have pretty much finished that process of privatizing state-owned enterprises. And they have decided that there's certain things they do not want to privatize. And that includes telecommunications, because media is powerful and they are afraid of what the media have become in America. They see how the private media can can sow divisions in society. You know, if we're watching MSNBC and Fox and CNN and we all have our poison, but the Chinese prefer one unified message, right? They don't want to have 12 different messages pulling the country in 12 different directions. So they're not going to privatize the media. They're not going to privatize their banks, right? We have private banks that make decisions about lending. The Chinese prefer to direct lending according to the priorities of the Communist Party. So most of their banks remain in state hands. And they're also paying the ended privatization on the energy sector. There's some small scale private sector energy, but all the big oil companies and all the big energy projects in China are state owned. And that's because they want to make sure that the power goes to the critical infrastructure that the party wants to support. And they don't trust the private sector to deliver energy. So it's going to be a hybrid system. You know, it's going to be partly state owned and partly capitalist. It's pretty effective. I would argue that our economy is also kind of a hybrid. You know, it's not pure capitalism. You know, we have elements in our economy that are not pure capitalism. And that's probably a good thing, right? You know, Social Security, I think, is a good thing. But it's not really capitalist. So the Chinese are going to have a hybrid, but they're going to stop short of a lot of the privatization that maybe they should make to get more efficient, you know, especially when it comes to finance, but also maybe energy too. Yeah.
Thank you, Frank. You know, it's clear we could, if we all had time, we could probably be discussing this stuff all day. This has been fascinating. And a big kudos to Cindy. Man, Cindy, if you got other interesting relatives, send them our way.
Yeah, bring 'em on.
And actually, I'd echo that to the whole group here. We're currently looking to line up December speakers. So anybody that's got good ideas, send me an email and we can follow up on it. But Frank, thank you again so much for your time.
Thank you guys. It's really a pleasure to talk to such a well-informed and engaged audience. And again, I commend you for, you know, being engaged citizens of the world and engaged citizens of Natick and caring about your local community, but also caring about the world. So thank you. It's my pleasure. And I think Mansfield would be very happy to see such citizens taking an interest in US and Asia.
That's good. Good. Thank you for that.